We'll also broadcast to YouTube. And then we will get started. All right. Welcome to our monthly webinar, Utilization-Focused Evaluation. I'm Charmaine Campbell-Patton. And you all know, I'm sure, Michael Quinn Patton, my dad and partner in this work. We're happy to be able to have a monthly webinar that features some of the different aspects of our new book, the 5th edition of Utilization-Focused Evaluation. And this month, we're looking at the first principle, which is to contextualize. But before we get started, I just want to do a land acknowledgement. We are coming to you from Minnesota, the homeland of the Dakota people, who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. Many Anishinaabe people also call this land home, having followed the Migas shell to the food that grows on the water, the wild rice. Indigenous people from other Native nations also reside in Minnesota and have made innumerable contributions to this region. We are settlers on this land, Michael and I. Our ancestors came to what became the United States from Ireland, England, and Scotland. They participated in and benefited from the attempted genocide of Native people and enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans. Despite centuries of colonial theft and violence, we know that this is still Indigenous land. Sorry, enabling live transcript. There you go. Sorry about that. And we also know that we have a responsibility to interrupt the generational legacies of colonialism, racism, and genocide that have continued to benefit from and do better. In Dakota culture, the year is measured by the moon and guided by the stars and seasons. The Dakota people name the moon after what occurred in nature at that time. So the full moon that we will see at the end of this week in Dakota culture is called the sore eyes moon. It's the last moon of the Dakota year. And when the sun shines so brightly against the snow, it can blind a person. We've definitely been seeing that here in Minnesota. But in the last day or so, the snow has begun to melt. We have puddles everywhere and spring is almost here. And we also know that land acknowledgement is only one small part of supporting Indigenous communities. So we've made a commitment to redistribute the royalties from this edition of Utilization-Focused Evaluation to support these two organizations that focus on Indigenous language, scholarship, and movement building. Wanted to set a little bit more context as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Michael to talk about our solidarity with the Ukraine.
Greetings, everyone. And I just saw in chat that Olga is with us from Ukraine. Olga, are you able to come off of mute and tell us what your situation is?
Hello, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Good. I'm in Kiev.
Us.
Yeah, I'm in Kiev, Ukraine. I am an independent evaluator, and I'm practicing evaluation for 8 years. And great to be with you about the situation. I can hear explosions from time to time, but they are mainly outside of Kiev, although 2 days ago a building was hit, which is 1 block from my house. But we stand for Ukraine, we stand with Ukraine, and we fight, and we know that we will win.
Well, thank you for joining us at this critical time. You make it very real for us. I have put in the chat a message from the president of the Ukraine Evaluation Association to for people to have a look at when you get a chance. This was a week ago, so it's a little out of date, but it will give people some sense of what she saw that was going on. And it is an amazing time to have you join us. Thank you for that. And you've seen in chat a lot of heartfelt greetings and appreciation for your being here with us today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your support. Thank you. I see it and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Another piece of context is that here in the US, we celebrate Women's History Month. And so we have a little video we wanted to start with. Michael, do you want to tee us up for the video?
So this is it's a 4-minute video, but it's worth, we think, thinking about how context comes in many different forms, since we're talking about contextualization. And this provides some historical, technological, and social context for the women's movement in the United States. So we thought, given Women's History Month, this is a little bit different perspective on some of that context.
When you think of the fight for women's rights, you probably think of pivotal figures such as Jane Addams, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth. But squarely in the center of this battle was one tool that completely changed the game. Susan B. Anthony said that it did more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. That tool was the bicycle? To understand how, you first have to understand the bicycle craze of the late 1800s. By the mid-19th century, the ordinary, or penny farthing, was the most common kind of bicycle. It was named that because its vastly different wheel sizes resembled the coin currency of the day, a penny and a farthing. You got it. You may have seen examples of these in Victorian illustrations.
They're not seeing your screen.
Aside from looking completely ridiculous, these bikes were unwieldy.
People aren't seeing the video.
Well, I'm sorry. I thought I was sharing it.
Yeah, I'm seeing the video. We're seeing it.
I was seeing it.
Oh, okay. Good.
Oh, all right. Somebody said they weren't seeing it.
Because of the unstable center
All
of
right,
gravity,
my bad.
even the smallest bump in the road could send a rider over the front in what was affectionately referred to as a header. They were also difficult for women to ride. It turns out it's virtually impossible to ride a penny farthing while wearing the giant hoop skirts that were in fashion at the time. Then in 1885, a man came along named John Kemp Starley, who said he felt the time had arrived for solving the problem of the cycle. He released his invention, the Rover safety bicycle, which was basically the first incarnation of what we now consider the modern bicycle. It had two 26-inch wheels, a diamond-shaped frame, and a rear-drive chain system. Bikes became smaller, safer, and more practical, and guess what? America f***ing loved them. Men and women alike flocked to these noiseless steeds in droves. In 1897 alone, over 2 million bicycles were sold. Even though these new modern bicycle designs were becoming enormously popular, and the drop frame construction did make it safer and easier to ride, biking in a big flowing skirt still sucked.
At that time, many women dressed in voluminous skirts with lots of slips underneath and ruffles, and that was not practical on a bicycle.
The new bicycle craze helped usher in a rational dress movement among women, which advocated moving away from uncomfortable, restrictive dresses. Bloomers, baggy undergarments that were more comfortable and practical than hoop skirts, were popular in the 1850s. With the growing popularity of bicycles, though, in the late 19th century, they came back with a vengeance and were adopted by prominent suffragettes of the time. These changes were threatening to some men, though, and many viewed women wearing pants as somehow depraved or immoral.
For some reason, some men were not happy with the idea of women wearing bifurcated garments.
Doctors also chimed in, warning about potential health risks for female cyclists like depression, heart palpitations, as well as something called bicycle face, which was said to cause women to become flushed, pale, and could result in dark shadows under their eyes. Still, none of this deterred women. In 1894, after hearing two wealthy Boston men bet $10,000 that a woman couldn't travel around the globe on a bicycle, Annie Londonderry, a 5'3", 100-pound housewife that had never ridden a bike before, took on the challenge, and with only a pearl-handled revolver and change of underwear, braved the desert, wars, and collisions with pigs on her journey around the world, which she completed in 1895. This mass adoption of bicycles significantly helped the feminist movement of the day. It changed the modes of dress and gave women increased mobility, but more importantly, it gave them a sense of autonomy. In 1890, just 5 years after the introduction of the safety bicycle, the National American Woman Suffrage Association was formed with the express purpose of lobbying state to state for women's right to vote. Two of its founders, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, are quoted as saying that woman is riding to suffrage on the bicycle. And that's exactly what they did in 1920.
So that's just a little bit of history.
You just
Right.
we'll
Oh,
put the
hold on. Starting to play another video. Sorry about that. Okay, go ahead, Michael.
people are asking for the link, which we can
Oh,
put
yeah,
in.
I can get that
But if
for
you
you.
just do a search for women's suffrage and bicycle, that will come up. And it many of you are international, so that was a very US focused kind of movement, but it's a reminder to look broadly at whatever context is in your own arena. About 10 years ago, when I was working with the International Development Research Center in Ottawa, which does work around the globe, they were with their technology unit. We looked back and I asked them, what was the biggest breakthrough technologically that affected development in the last decade? This would have probably been 10 years ago, looking back. And there was widespread agreement that it was the mobile phone, especially in Africa, that had significantly changed the way in which women could communicate with each other, support each other, get information, and that they acknowledged that none of their planning, none of their strategy had foreseen the importance of mobile phones for development. And so the beginning point for us in some ways is to say that context involves more than just whatever an immediate program is. It includes the things that are going on around it, including globally. And clearly these days that includes both the pandemic and the crisis in Ukraine.
And from a utilization-focused evaluation perspective, we wanted to sort of put UFE in context of some of the other evaluation approaches, particularly those that Michael has developed over the last 10 years or so. And so utilization-focused evaluation is really the biggest context for developmental evaluation, which then also includes principles-focused evaluation, and then Blue Marble evaluation. And so if you're joining us as a Blue Marble evaluation network member, welcome, and know that this is really foundational to Blue Marble evaluation as well. And so we're happy to be able to dig deep into UFE and particularly the principles. So I'm gonna turn it over to Michael to just talk about why we've taken a principles-focused approach to UFE in this edition.
Yeah, the fifth edition of Utilization Focused that Charmaine has joined me on is really very different than the 4 previous editions. Those of you who've been tracking this with us, the first edition of Utilization Focused came out in 1978, and subsequent editions have come out about every 10 years and have been very much about the steps that you go through in an evaluation. We have put that information primarily online this time and focus less upon the linear steps or the checklist, all of which is still available and relevant, but giving the increased importance of principles in our work to guide actions within different contexts. So it's very appropriate that we're talking about contextualizing, because a major purpose of principles is to provide guidance in dealing with different kinds of context. And so the new edition of the book identifies 10 principles operationally within the overarching principle of being focused on intended use by intended users from the very beginning and for every aspect of it and every stage of an evaluation. And so the principles provide guidance, they affect use. You see the full list of 10 principles. We'll be discussing one a month. And these we feel are the core of thinking in terms of use, but adapting these principles to context. And that's what principles do. They're not rules, they're not steps, they're not detailed procedures. They are guiding ways of then applying them within whatever particular context you are in. And so this first principle is to understand and take into a context the situation in which you find yourself and in which the evaluation will occur.
So the primary way to do that is through a situation analysis, where we really identify and take into account those situational factors. Some of that is about the past, what has been done in the past patterns of evaluation use, and barriers and opportunities within that, as well as what's happening currently. And really thinking about who, the stakeholder analysis, mapping of stakeholders and resources, risk assessment to identify what is going to support or hinder evaluation use, and what could go wrong potentially with evaluation. And it's not something that you do one time. It's really an ongoing process, but it is important to think about it right from the very start. And design would flow from that situation recognition and context analysis. It can be expansive or more contracted depending on resources and needs, and again can be built upon over the course of time. It doesn't need to be all done at the beginning, but it should always be at the front and center of how things begin. One example of a situation analysis that I've done in my work is a few years ago, I worked with a team on a juvenile justice initiative that was going to be rolled out in the state of Nebraska. And what they wanted was to really understand how juvenile justice had been happening in the state over time, so that this new initiative could be rolled out in context and we could design a developmental evaluation that drew lessons from that. And so they really understood the value of a situation analysis to begin this work. And we looked across the state. We interviewed dozens of stakeholders to create a retrospective of juvenile justice reform that then helped us identify strengths and barriers to past reform efforts, key stakeholders and resources. And we were able to communicate with and identify primary intended users about the findings and bring them along during that process, so that the situation analysis was really core to that design piece of rolling out the initiative. And one other important piece that we looked at in that situation assessment was equity and inclusion focused factors, because that was going to be really important as well. So it's identifying values within the situation assessment as well. That are going to be key. And we've talked about these values in past webinars, but this is a place where you can really bring them up and help put context around them as you're rolling out a new initiative. Michael, do you want to say anything?
This sounds like something that would be automatic, that you would do an evaluation, but unfortunately it turns out to be fairly rare in my experience for a couple of reasons. One is that a large amount of international evaluations and evaluations required by government units or by philanthropic organizations already began with a template for what the evaluation is going to cover, what kind of data is going to be collected. It may require a logic model and SMART goals. It may have forms that have to be filled out, maybe a results-based management kind of framework that people are going to have to conduct evaluation in. The commissioners have already laid out what they want the evaluation to do. And what that tends to do is to preempt any kind of situation analysis. And when I've worked with programs around the world at the local and middle level, and even often at headquarters, a major complaint about the required mandated evaluations that they're implementing is that they don't fit context, is that they're not context sensitive. They don't allow adaptation to context. So we think it's really important, even with a standardized, predetermined evaluation design, to back up and say, what's the context for where that comes from? How did we end up with this standardized, top-down, required evaluation system? Where is there room for adaptation? How can we create that kind of room? What kind of situation do we need to take into account? And certainly COVID increased the extent to which people became aware of the need for adaptation and situation analysis. The other thing that mitigates against this is the pressure that evaluators often feel to get right down to design and methods. That when you bring people together, if you do, or if you're talking to intended users, that they want to know, what's the evaluation going to cover? What are we going to measure? What's the design going to be? What methods are going to be using? And that urgency to get on with the task short circuits the contextual work of figuring out what really is the situation. And what we have found is that use ultimately depends, as Charmaine said, upon understanding who the users are, what their situation is, what's going on in the larger world that affects what's happening, and taking the time to do that really pays off at the end. It's one of the facilitation principles called go slow to go fast. Take the time up front to build understanding and context and relationships, and then you can make up for that with increased effectiveness later on, because you understand the context and the situation and have built relationships with key people.
One thing to keep in mind about scope is that, this can get really expansive really quickly. And so the UFE min specs, which we talked about in the previous webinar, if you weren't able to make it, there's a link on our website and on the YouTube page as well, is to really bring it back to these min specs and think about how will this affect us in this situation, and help to really, focus the situation analysis on what's going to be most important to implement these. This is another tool that we offer in the book in chapter 6, which is a force field analysis. And this is a way to really elevate factors that are going to support evaluation use, and how to strengthen those positive factors, and then factors that may constrain or undermine evaluation use, and identify potential ways to address those. And so it's getting those on the table up front and thinking proactively about what you could do. And obviously as well, more things will arise and you'll learn as you go. But again, it's helpful to start with this to really surface some of the assumptions about use or potential barriers of use with the primary intended users. Michael, you want to talk about some of the considerations for a force
An
or for a
example of
situation?
an example of changed context that I've just put in the chat is the movement from a focus just on theory of change and projects and programs having a theory of change to transformation and a theory of transformation that, given the global emergency, the climate emergency, social justice crisis, the crisis in Ukraine, the way in which the economy is being affected, the largest number of refugees since World War II, not just in Europe, but around the world, increasing number of climate refugees, that the attention to transformation and systems is very different than attention to programs. So within evaluation itself, the context for what we're focusing on is changing. At the program level, as this slide shows, it makes a difference to understand whether you're dealing with an existing program, a new program, a startup, a program that's in transition, leadership transition, purpose transition, resources transitioning. What's the situation with the program? How are their value commitments emerging or changing? What kind of time and engagement commitments are people willing to do? What's been their past history with evaluation? What's the role and position of the evaluation? And from a systems perspective, figuring out where the boundaries are for the evaluation within that larger context is one of the early considerations. And as Charmaine said, you can't take on everything, but we find that by raising the issue of how people are thinking about context, what they're paying attention to, and what the relevance may be in ways that they haven't considered before, can really make a difference to the use of the evaluation. So it's not a matter of having a detailed agenda or checklist. It's a matter of sensitively asking the question, what things are happening in your program, in your community, in the larger context that will affect what's going to be going on in this particular initiative. So one of the frames that I found particularly helpful, many of you will be familiar with this, but it's worth a quick review, is the distinctions that we introduced in the book, Getting to Maybe, How the World Has Changed, that I did with Frances Wesley and Brenda Zimmerman, studying major social movements. And Brenda Zimmerman had introduced the distinctions between simple, complicated, and complex. David Snowden, former director of knowledge management at IBM, and now director of Cognitive Edge, has been working with these distinctions in much of the business world and elsewhere. My experience with them came from working with Brenda and the work that she had been doing. And I find it continues to be a useful way to both engage people around how they think about these distinctions and as a way to make sense of what's going on. So we're going to take you through a reminder for those of you who are familiar with them of how to use these distinctions, and for those of you who are new to it, to explain why we think it's useful. So it begins with this notion that situational analysis and responsiveness and context sensitivity needs some kind of heuristics to help us make sense of it. We're certainly clarifying and focusing on intended users as an overarching utilization-focused principle, focusing and clarifying intended uses, being committed to methodological appropriateness, identifying the criteria for evaluating the evaluation, the credibility and meaningfulness. And so within that, what we need and what we use, all of us, the way our brains work, is we need some beginning points to ask questions, to make sense of things. And so the frame that Brenda Zimmerman introduced out of the work of Stanley came from a two-dimensional scale. On the horizontal dimension is how certain are we about how to create a desired outcome. The degree of certainty, meaning how much knowledge do we have about how to produce the desired results. And on the vertical axis is how much agreement is there about what to do in the stakeholder environment. So where there's a high degree of certainty and a high degree of agreement about what to do, that's what's called simple space. It doesn't mean it's not simplistic, it's not easy. It's simple in the sense that we know what to do and there's agreement about what to do. And that's where plan and control works. That's actually where randomized controlled trials work, because you're looking at something very concrete, very specific to look at its effects. And so our metaphor for that, where the interrelationships are very tight, where you can see what needs to be done, there's linear cause and effect. Everyone knows the right answer within the current context, which of course may not be self-evident to others, hence the importance of context, that simple arena, that known arena, is where you can aim at things like best practices. We use the metaphor of a recipe. Recipe is essential. Recipes are tested to assure replicability. No particular expertise is needed. Knowing how to cook increases success. Recipes are aimed at producing standard results and bear the certainty of the same results every time if followed. So when you're in simple space, it's pretty clear what's going to be happening, what the steps are, what people are trying to accomplish, and you're testing whether or not that recipe actually works. That's quite different than a complicated situation. And the polio vaccine, the campaign to eliminate polio, is a good example of these distinctions, as is the coronavirus itself. So I actually was, when I was growing up, a part of the polio vaccination trial of the Salk vaccine. We were lined up in the gym in two groups and tested without, in those days, any kind of informed consent. So I followed the worldwide effort to eradicate polio, which is taking longer than expected. The vaccine itself, the administering of the vaccine, is simple in the sense that we know it works. This is true of the coronavirus vaccine as well. We know that it works, that it's safe, that it, in the case of polio, keeps people from getting polio. But having a polio campaign is complicated because it involves lots of people, lots of effort, lots of players. And as we're going to see, it's complex because in a changing environment, trying to run a campaign becomes difficult. So complicated is where the interrelationships between the elements are looser. Cause and effect is nonlinear. It's interactive, interdependency. Relationships are able to be modeled and predicted. Expertise is involved. But what makes things complicated is lots of players and lots of things to have work, lots of things to fit together. And the example that we use there is the example of sending a rocket to into space. This is technically complicated. It has lots of parts, and both of these space shuttle disasters resulted from the failure of very small parts. The first space shuttle disaster was the result of an O-ring that cost $100 that didn't function in the freezing temperatures of that January day. And the Columbia disaster was the loss of a piece of foam. And so things are complicated when there are lots of things to make right, when a lot has to happen. Formula are critical and necessary. Sending one rocket doesn't assure that the next will work. high degree of expertise is needed in different fields, and yet it's not certain that everything will work because of all the things that are involved, including then the social side of being complicated, having lots of people. In the space shuttle disasters, there were, when they looked at them, there were the technical complications of the O-ring and the piece of foam, but it turns out that there were political complications between the technical people at NASA and the political appointees who were administering the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, and that their conflict contributed to those disasters. We move into complex space when there's a high degree of technical complication and social complication, things like implementing human rights agreements, environmental initiatives, where the stakes get very high with lots of people involved and lots of uncertainty about exactly what to do. That's what we call complex space. And things are complex where very loosely connected in networks, cause and effect cannot be predetermined. Situation is turbulent, is emergent, not controllable, and only understandable in retrospect. And the metaphor that Brenda introduced for that was raising a child. That's in the zone of complexity. That formula have only limited application. Raising one child is no assurance of success with the next. If you have multiple children or siblings, you know how different children are. Every child is unique, and we're never quite sure where things are going to work out.
Ya resolvimos muchas cosas con Esteban.
So
Se me fue decirle esto de
we
Anita,
need
esto
to
es lo que estoy tecleando ahora.
Just a minute.
Y ayudó muchísimo.
you go on mute.
Y la dinámica es completamente.
There we go.
Yeah,
Sorry
thank
about that. I couldn't find it.
Paul Frankel is making an important point about the O-rings. So at any rate, these metaphors I found is helpful in working with intended users in the beginning of an evaluation to have them talk about how they see things, what they're doing would fall into the simple category, what's complicated, what's complex, because this has implications for how much the design is going to be fixed in advance, how much outcomes are known, how flexible and adaptable things are going to need to be. And so this final slide shows these options together, where we're trying to avoid the chaos which we find in war zones and economic meltdowns, where you're simply trying to get back to stability. So these final slide shows the simple, complicated, and complex together. Next slide, Charmaine. And this is one way of engaging people with this work and not being very hardcore about the distinctions, but a way to open up the conversation about what the situation is. Asking what's simple, what's complicated, what's complex, and engaging with people. They'll often disagree or have different perceptions about it, and that itself is worth surfacing.
There's a question in the chat about the learning process between failure and success. Do you want to answer that?
This is a part of what we do in an ongoing way, and one of the issues, at least for today's discussion, is how we understand either success or failure related to context, because there are interventions that can be quite effective in one context and not work in another context. That's part of the challenge of scaling. So from a principles-focused point of view, we find that one of the big challenges with all the pressure going on about scaling and expanding interventions, where that works in one context is that they often fail in a new context because they haven't been sensitive or adaptable to that new context. And it's very different than from a principles-focused approach or developmental evaluation approach to treat the very determination of what constitutes success as not a fixed, simple model, but as a set of principles that can be adapted to a new context. And that's actually one of the big battles of our time, is how you bring about large-scale change. Is it through the dissemination of fixed models, or is it bottoms-up adaptation of principles to context? And the differences between success and failure in those situations is quite dramatic. So David Snowden, I mentioned, and Mary Boone published this framework for the Harvard Business Review. It's one of the most downloaded articles they have. And they concluded that wise executives tailor their approach to fit the complexity of the circumstances they face. For evaluators, the mantra shown on the next slide is that wise evaluators tailor their approach to fit the complexity of the circumstances they face. And that means spending this time up front to think about what is the situation, what is the context, and how does that affect what we do.
So just a few more notes about situation assessment, particularly thinking about paying attention to situations that can pose particular challenges to evaluation use. If you think about intended users, in simple situations, you'll likely have a small number and have people pretty much on the same page. Complicated, you'll have multiple that may have different perspectives, but you can still identify who they are and, you know, be able to elevate those and understand them. In complex situations, you'll have different levels of intended users, very, you know, a very complex map of systems that are interrelated and interdependent. And so it's much harder to kind of grasp who the intended users are, and it requires much more attention to ongoing changes to that situation. The focus, as Michael said, kind of more of a single program focus versus in complex, more of an innovation focus where things are changing and developing, dealing with crisis or uncertainty. Intended uses, you have more of a specific program to make a judgment on, and you get towards complex, and it's more of that innovative systems change adaptation approach. And in facilitation, thinking about, you know, just in simple situations, spent a lot of time thinking about program models back in, you know, when you have a very specific program, a logic model or a theory of change, outcomes, impacts. Whereas when you get to more complex situations, you're talking more about real-time adaptation, ongoing attention to timely feedback, principles that can guide work in a complex environment. So this just kind of captures some of the different things you'll be looking for when you think about a situation, particularly focused on useful evaluation. You want to say anything more about that?
Well, I think you've covered it well.
So we already talked about this, but just also want to return to this idea that this is not a one-time thing, that it's ever-present, context is ever-present and ever-changing. And so it's not just a front-end activity. And, you know, as we've seen with the pandemic and all of these different factors that continue to change, it requires a continual attention to context. As you're juggling all of these different things, context is always there. And so it begins at the front, but continues to be important to pay attention to those ongoing factors. So we are going to
You have an example of that.
What's that?
I was about to mention, Charmaine, the immediate context that we're dealing with here in Minnesota. We're coming to you from Minnesota, as you heard at the top. And just as programs we're getting in schools, we're getting back to classrooms and in-person classrooms. In Minneapolis last week, the teachers went on strike. And so all education programs are now on hold again, and kids are out of school again. So that these kind of things emerge rapidly, and they can have long-term consequences. So it's increasingly important for us to be able to adapt to those changing situations. So we are going to take you out to Mentimeter to give you an opportunity to weigh in on some of the factors that you take into account. You can also put questions in chat, but what do you consider in contextualizing? And as you put in some of your responses, we'll bring those forward. So it's, you go to menti.com and enter in the code that you see on the screen there, 75431378, and then you can enter in as many as 2 or 3 if you want to, factors that you take into account in your own contextualizing, and give us a chance to learn together from what your presentations are. So, so Charmaine, if you hit the, yeah, there you go. Who is holding power? Power dynamics are very important. Whose voices need to be heard? Trajectories, historical and transformational, understanding. One of the things we're increasingly doing with developmental evaluation, Charmaine just finished one of these for a school program, is retrospective developmental evaluation. And I have featured a retrospective developmental evaluation of the World Food Program. I'll put that link into the chat so that before beginning a new evaluation, you do look backwards at how did they get from there to here. Would you read some of these off, Charmaine?
The influence of different stakeholder groups, influence, power again, who really wants the evaluation done and who doesn't. Intended user, definitely source of discomfort during the evaluation process. One of the things we start off with often is trying to surface some of those past experiences with evaluation to get a sense of who, yeah, that level of comfort, who has had negative experiences with evaluation, getting that on the table so that we know kind of where people are coming to this work from. Stakeholders' strengths, the anticipation of the future, evaluation design and implementation. Understanding of and previous experience with evaluation, just mentioned that, yes, for sure. Who are my key stakeholders? History, ecology, traditional ecological knowledge, definitely. Political will for listening and learning. Intended use and intended users. Interest for learning by key stakeholders, not just the project uses. Issues of governance, specifically governance response to ecosystem change, using timelines, trends, and key social and ecological variables. Available resources. Who are the players? Negotiation and maneuvering with multiple stakeholders. So many layers indeed. Who requested the evaluation? Intangible culture. And this, I know there was a question earlier about values and how you surface them at this point. One of the things that in the example that I mentioned previously in Nebraska, there was sort of both the implicit and the explicit. So you can look at what values are made explicit, stated in the program. And then as we were looking at interviews with key stakeholders and documents and things like that, trying to understand whether those were showing up in the work and also what other values were there or issues were there that weren't being made explicit. So trying to kind of understand, the extent to which things match with what's being stated, as well as kind of what's not being said, and that requires some level of relationship building too, right? To make sure that we were going into youth detention centers and talking with young people about their actual experience in the juvenile justice system, not just talking to the adults in the system who are saying what the system was supposed to be doing. We were also looking at what the actual experience of the youth in the system were, and we tried to surface some of those things with art and arts-based evaluation, which if you haven't seen Nora Murphy and A. Raphael Johnson's new book, Creative Evaluation, they are really doing a ton with arts-based evaluation. I have it here somewhere. Here it is. So just a plug for their book. And this is based on a book that Michael wrote back in 1980 something, and a new take on this idea of creative evaluation. But so that's, one way to surface values is really thinking about it creatively, all the ways that values do get presented, and culture, I think, is a big part of that as well. I'm sure there are many more. I'll scroll through a few more and then we'll move on to the next slide. Yeah, does that sound good? Power dynamics, diversity, timeline. We've got starting to get some repetition. So should we go to the next slide here? How do I do that? There we go. All right, so go back to
nobody.
Yeah.
Interestingly, nobody, at least I didn't notice, listed technology. And we began with the women's suffrage and the bicycle and changing fashion. And certainly the way that we're able to have Olga join us from Ukraine is a matter of the internet technology and how that's changing, access to technology and other kinds of technological changes that are going on and affecting programs. And so these kinds of changes can be both positive and negative. I had the opportunity as part of the UN Food Systems Summit to make a presentation as a part of the work I did on that last year in Rome in August in preparation for the summit. There were 400 people gathered. It was my first face-to-face conference since the pandemic had begun. And of course, everyone had their devices there. And the thing that startled me about the change in technology and context is that pre-pandemic, when we did workshops or had conferences, people tried to be subtle about using their mobile phones or their laptops or iPads while someone was speaking. What I found in Rome, and I invite, as you come back to more conferencing and face-to-face, what struck me in Rome was that, and I attribute it partly to the endless Zooming that's gone on, is that people were not subtle at all about the fact that they weren't paying attention. When I was speaking to a room of 400, and not just me, very important, distinguished major figures giving presentations, you'd look out and the entire audience was on their devices, not really paying attention or multitasking. So the norms, the etiquette about technology in some ways is changing. And that is something to pay attention to, is how we do norm setting. That's another thing that we often do in a utilization-focused evaluation as part of discussing context, is what norms and values are going to inform our work together, including how to use technology, how to engage with each other, and how to pay attention to the larger context. So this final Mentimeter is inviting your takeaways about anything at all from the session today, or in the larger scope of things. What's coming up for you? What are you taking away? And I'll let you read these, Charmaine.
Who or what is going to legitimize the evaluation or delegitimize it? Establishing whether the situation is simple, complicated, or complex, and deciding on the methodological appropriateness of various tools. Contextualizing is key for inclusive evaluation, a relevant design and adapting methodology to the particular system as a whole. One of the most challenging aspects, processes in an evaluation and in developing interventions, a fundamental dimension shaping evaluations and interventions, but also the most usually forgotten one. Indeed, and you know, as we close out, I think one of the things that's really helpful when you think about context is just this idea that different, you know, there are going to be different experiences with context as well. So when we talk about inclusivity and thinking about different ways to understand the context, as I mentioned with arts-based evaluation, you know, really taking into account what those different perspectives might be, and as you go along, continuing to adapt your data and methods to as you learn more about the context to be able to be more inclusive and representative. Helps make the evaluation process less cumbersome, right? Go slow to go fast. Open the conversation by clarifying what is simple, complicated, and complex. Contextualizing is an ongoing process. Ultimately should shape one's evaluation. Great, so I've had some requests of sharing, so I will share all of these takeaways and ideas for contextualizing with you all. You're all registered, so I'll send a follow-up email. We also want to invite you to follow Michael on YouTube if you haven't already. He's putting out nearly daily videos on many of these different themes. And so you can follow him. And do you want to tee up anything that's coming up, Michael?
I just put out the video on criteria for evaluating transformation, and we'll be having videos later this week and next week on Blue Marble evaluation, on sustainability and equity, and we'll be covering a number of these topics, both brief examples that you can use, 3, 4 to 6 minute YouTubes, and then longer full hour ones to go more deeply in. So we'll be adding to those, and if you have particular topics that you would like to see us do more on, we're happy to do that. And we'll invite you to join us next month.
Yeah, we'll be here again next April, in April, whatever month it is, losing track. April for our next monthly webinar, the third Wednesday. Hopefully you've signed up. If not, you can still do so. We'll send out the link, and we really appreciate you being with us. Thank you so much.
Stay safe, Olga. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah.
Really
thank you, Olga.
appreciate your being with us.